Series this morning. The title of this sermon is called Playing the Long Game, and we're going to be in John chapter 11. I am going to read verses 1 through 45. It's a long passage. I've edited out some of the verses that aren't pertinent to us this morning to shorten it. I'll be reading in the English Standard Version, but this is a story. It's a narrative so that it's true, but it's meant to be listened to as story. So as I read it, I want you to try to connect with the people. I want you to try to sense the emotions that they're feeling. I want you to try to put yourself in their place. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent to Jesus, saying, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he's some days' journey now from where the sisters are, ministering in another part of Israel. When Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Mary and her sister Martha and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Now when Jesus came, he found Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. But Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection of the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet shall he live, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." I think we have something frozen up. I have it here in front of me. Oh, there we go. And when she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." When she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was, she saw him. She fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping. He was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus, in his humanity, wept. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. Robin and I have been binge watching yet another series in our recovery time called Grey's Anatomy. It's a medical drama, and it follows a group of surgical interns from their internship all the way up through their career. There's one intern by the name of Dr. Yang, and she is a gifted and skilled surgeon, and she is highly focused on cardiac surgery. She lives it, she breathes it, she learns everything she can about it, and all through her internship, she made sure she wiggled into all the hardest surgeries and was able to participate and honed her skills until she had quite a reputation for excellence. But then the hospital brought in a new mentor for her, a Dr. Altman. And Dr. Altman immediately started to torture Dr. Yang. sent her back to the basics, had her perform menial surgeries like appendectomies, sent her to sit with patients and monitor them overnight when that's clearly the job of a nurse. Well, finally, as her training progressed and she was tortured and tortured and tortured by this Dr. Altman, she could not see what the point was. There came a moment when she was in an OR and there was an intern below her that was performing the surgery. When the intern got in trouble, instead of Dr. Yang stepping in, telling her to move away, she stepped aside, patiently walked the intern through the surgery. Dr. Altman caught her later and said, "You've arrived. I can't teach you anymore." See, Yang wanted to play the short game. She wanted to avoid everything she didn't think was necessary and go right for the cardiac surgery. But Dr. Altman was playing the long game with her. Now, what do I mean by this long game, short game? There's a career advice blogger by the name of Kelly Nash, and she defines it this way. Playing the long game means focusing on long-term outcomes while taking small intentional steps to achieve what you want. It means avoiding instant gratification and focusing on building a foundation that will better serve you in the future. Dr. Altman took Dr. Yang and had her build a more solid foundation. She became a doctor who was empathetic and gentle with her patients. She became patient with her coworkers, and she became an excellent teacher to those who needed it. She was transformed by the long game. Well, we're in a series called Take Heart. We've been looking at John 16:33, where Jesus tells us, "In the world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Last week, Eric opened the series by teaching us that when God's people don't understand different experiences of suffering, we can still take hope in a promise-keeping God who's told us the end of our story, even though we don't know the route we're going to take to get there. This week, we want to ask one question. If Jesus has really overcome the world, why do his people suffer? He says, "I've overcome the world," but yet you'll have trouble. It's complexing. Well, we're going to try to answer three big questions about suffering. Why do we suffer? Where is God when we suffer? And what's the purpose of our suffering? Now, we can all admit that when it comes to suffering, we want to play the short game, don't we? We want it gone, we want it gone quickly, and we want to avoid it at all costs, even if it makes making foolish decisions. This morning, we're going to learn that there are answers to our three big questions, but they don't involve the short game. You see, like Dr. Altman, God, he's not playing games with us, but he's taking an approach to maturing us, where he's taking time to redeem us, to mature us, to grow us through the suffering. He's transforming us into a Christ-like character. Now, the verse everybody goes to for suffering is an annoying little verse in Romans 8:28. Everything works together for good to those that love God. Well, in our Psalm of Lament this morning, we can clearly see that suffering is not good. And we'll get back to that verse later. Here's our big idea. Suffering prepares God's people for a world without pain. Suffering prepares God's people for a world without pain. Suffering is part of our human condition. I don't think there's anybody that can argue with that. It's all around us. We can't escape it. But it is part of our reality. So before we continue, I want to say that all of us have experienced some form of suffering. There is suffering that just goes on just because of the fact that we live in a sin-cursed world. There's the daily sufferings of life. But then there are also deep hurts and deep traumas and deep betrayals. And what I would ask you is this: when you consider this morning maybe some of your own suffering, let's be careful not to compare our suffering with other people's. You see, my story is my story. My journey is my journey. Your story is your story. And God is doing something different in you than he's doing with me. The danger of comparing our suffering is that we might just minimize our own. Well, I don't go through what they do, so I have no reason to be suffering. Or we might minimize the suffering of others. Well, you shouldn't be complaining. Look what I've gone through. And so we want to avoid both of those extremes. We're going to look at two examples this morning of suffering, of human beings who've suffered. The first is in John 11 that we read, a Christian family who's in loving relationship with Jesus Christ. We saw that 2 times in the passage. Verse 3, the sisters called to Jesus, sent a note to him, Lord, the one whom you love is ill. And then in verse 5, John makes it very clear, now Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Christian family in loving relationship with Jesus, but they're suffering as they watch their brother die of an unknown disease. There's also a more contemporary example that I'm going to share with you. We'll just call it the boy's story, and I'll read parts of his story throughout the sermon as we go. First part, the boy was probably saved as early as kindergarten. He was taught about Jesus and never remembers a time when he wasn't conscious of his own sin and need for a Savior. In his early years, he lived in his grandparents' home with his mother, his parents having divorced. While he was loved, there was never a time when he didn't feel out of place in his own skin. Didn't have a complete family like his friends and cousins, and always feeling like the third wheel, he reasoned that he must be a cosmic mistake. At age 10, his mother remarried. He moved to a new home. He remembers the excitement of hope for a normal family, and that his mother would finally be taken care of, but something was wrong. His mother continued to struggle financially. Why didn't his stepfather help her? They still went to church, but why didn't the stepfather go? Why was his mother so sad? Well, it didn't take long before what was happening in secret exploded in full view of the boy. He didn't have words for it then, but his mother was being abused. For 3 full years, he feared coming home every day and remembers lying in bed with the covers over his head, hearing her being chased across the house, screaming that she would call the police. Nobody ever came to rescue this boy. Now, under those covers, he began to think, could he get to the gun cabinet quickly enough before being caught? Could he load the shotgun and put an end to the shouting? Now, he never did, and for decades later, he lived with the false shame that told him he was never man enough to silence the abuser. Loving aunt and uncle finally took them under their wing and helped them escape. By then, the boy was a powder keg of anger and confusion. Now, to make sense of it all, he began to reason certain false truths. He had no value. No one loved him. God only tolerated him, and he would always be alone. He made it through high school, a straight-A student, and went to college, where he fell apart on the inside. In his anger, he sent God to his room to think about what he had done, vowing to be done with him for good. Well, God was not done with the boy, and no matter how much he tried to drown the pain with all the allures of a secular campus, God pursued him relentlessly. But he only returned to God out of shame, with the understanding that he was nothing more than a doorstop or a bedpan in God's kingdom. So why do we suffer? Very simple answer. We're broken and our world is broken. Adam and Eve, our first parents, God created a good world for them to live in. And they chose instead to do life outside of the plan that God had created for them. That disobedience is what the Bible calls sin. They chose their own path. And the punishment for that sin is what the Bible calls the curse. We experience suffering because of our own sin and because of the sins of others. And in Romans 8:20, it says that even creation itself groans under the weight of this curse. Why are there natural disasters? Why is our world falling apart? Why are tsunamis wipe out thousands of people? Well, the creation itself groans under the weight of the curse. Because of the curse, Lazarus died, and his family suffered. Because of sin, people suffer so much that mental health professionals have even created a test to measure human suffering. It's called the ACEs test, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And they've created 10 different groups of traumatic experiences that a child could experience. And through 10 questions, you get an ACE score of 1 to 10. Now, then what they've done is they've tracked and studied people who have high ACE scores to see what's their life like compared to others who don't have ACE scores. Here's just a few statistics. Adults with an ACE score of 4 or more are 1,220% more likely to attempt suicide, 1,000% more likely to inject drugs, 460% more likely to have recent depression, and 390% more likely to have lung disease. Adults with an ACE score of just 2 or more are 400% more likely to consider themselves alcoholics. And here's a stat I want you to keep in mind: resiliency. This is the ability to flourish despite the adverse childhood experiences. Of children that had one adverse experience, only 35% demonstrated the ability to flourish in spite of it. If you go to 2 or more, only 16% had the ability to flourish. The boy in our story, he made it to the 1%, the 1% of people that had an ACE score of 7 or more. See, this boy scored a 7 out of 10 on his test. Here's another piece of his story. As we forward through the boy's life, he bottled up the past, stuffed it down, and decided that it was irrelevant. He married and had a son, but the anger always simmered under the surface, and it came out to hurt the ones he loved. It came out in self-destruction. The results of our ACE studies. Now, you might have an objection here, and I would be surprised if you didn't. You might be saying, this isn't fair. Our first parents millennia ago make a bad decision, and the world's plunged into suffering. It's not right. Exactly, it's not right. And by the way, why did God let sin and evil in the first place? Why didn't he stop it? Well, there are theological answers to those questions that I could help you with, and I'm happy to do so if you want to catch me offline. But the point for this morning is, we live in a world of suffering. It is our reality. And the Bible, instead of just pushing it aside like it's nothing or ignoring it, it tackles human suffering head on. It addresses it, and it gives us hope. So if we're broken and our world is broken, the second natural question becomes, where's God when we suffer? This is a clip from CNN, but you could find it on almost any news outlet at some point or another. Where is God when tragedy strikes? Atheists may ask that question to prove that there is no God. Unbelievers may choose to ask the question to disparage the Christian God. But even we as Christians ask that question. When we look around and we see the suffering around us and what we experience, we say it's not fair. We wonder where God is. Or maybe our suffering has taken us to such a dark place that we cry out, "Where are you, God?" because we can't find you. The John story of this Christian family is going to tell us exactly where God is when we suffer. First, he's present with us. Where did Mary and Martha send the note? They didn't have to pray. They could talk directly to Jesus. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, had come to earth and took on human form. He was literally present with his people. And he came to endure all the suffering that we suffer so that he is a great high priest who can empathize with our weaknesses. He knows what we've gone through. And that suffering culminated in the cross, where he suffered, where he abused, and he died on behalf of his people. And he's present with us in this life through the person of the Holy Spirit. And his presence guarantees his control. In verse 4, what did Jesus say when he heard the news? This illness does not lead to death. Mary and Martha and Lazarus were never outside of Jesus' plan and outside of his control. But more than that, Jesus grieves with us. The Bible does not say have a stiff upper lip. The Bible does not say you need to be happy, happy, joy, joy, even when you're going through it. That is false. Jesus looked at Martha and Mary, who were falling at his feet. Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. Lord, it's not right. We don't see you. Death shouldn't happen when you're near us. Note on the side that Jesus never reprimands his people for grief. He just wants that grief to be brought to him where he can deal with it. There are two places in this passage, verse 33 and 38, where Jesus, who is present with us, who grieves with us, it says that Jesus was deeply moved. That's the understatement. That Greek word is used of a horse's snort. Have you ever heard a horse snort? Jesus was indignant. He was outraged at the death and the sin and Satan and evil had entered his good world and caused suffering on his people. Jesus was outraged. And he was outraged enough that he wept with his people. Now, you might have heard a term in our contemporary culture called virtue signaling. It's usually used in a negative fashion, where someone wants to tell other people what a good person they are. So in other words, when Ukraine got invaded by Russia, everybody's social media had a Ukraine flag on it. They didn't know where Ukraine was. They didn't know what was going on. They had no intention to help, but they're a good person because they put up a flag. They had no intention to do anything about it. Jesus never virtue signals. Jesus entered into our pain and wept with us. But more than that, he came to conquer everything that brings us pain. Everything. In verse 40, he says, Mary, did I not tell you if you believed you would see the glory of God? And she says, God, Jesus, I don't know about this. Don't pull back the stone. There's nothing you can do. And Jesus, in that moment, gave the family a foreshadowing of his work on the cross. A time when he would destroy death and evil and sin, and he would conquer it on behalf of his people. He cried out, Lazarus, come forth. And death itself bowed to the Creator because he has authority over even death. Jesus came to give people hope. And he came to give people a taste of what is to come for those who have faith in him. A time when Jesus overcoming the world will be fully experienced by all of his people. So where was God when the boy suffered? Through a variety of circumstances that are part of someone else's story, this boy finally broke down and entered Christian counseling. With that help, the prayers of a loving wife and an inner circle of church friends, he began the journey to healing. The healing led to a reset on his understanding of God, to a new understanding of God's sovereignty, his love, his mercy, and his grace. The boy did have value in God's eyes. He was not a cosmic mistake. See, Jesus was redeeming all 7 of his ACE scores. God was making the boy beautiful in his eyes and useful in his kingdom. The boy couldn't answer our 3 big questions while he was going through that pain. It wasn't until later, till God began to view his character and reveal his character and presence, that the boy's vision changed. Why did the boy suffer? Well, whatever else, the boy knows that God was not being cruel. God needed to humble and shape the boy for useful service in his kingdom. The boy doesn't blame God, but rejoices that he does all things well. And it really was for his ultimate good. Where was God when the boy suffered? He was right next to him, putting boundaries and limits on the boy's suffering. Jesus wept with the boy while he carried him. Jesus suffered and died to make the boy whole and to overcome everything that brings the boy pain. He came to conquer everything for us. So what's the purpose of suffering? Well, I don't particularly like to visit the doctor's office. I don't have anything against my doctor. I like my primary care physician. He's a good guy. But the doctor's office frustrates me every time I go. And the pain occurs between the front door and the exam room. The journey it takes to get to the doctor, which is the same every time. I go in. I stand in line. I go in, there's somebody there to check me in. First, they want to verify my information. Now, I'm not allowed to say nothing has changed since the last time. No, we have to go through the list. Did your insurance change? No. Did your pharmacy change? No. Did your address change? No. Did your employment change? No. You have to sit there and go, no, 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 no. And then in a digital world where the nurses are tapping on iPads and the doctors are tapping on computers, all my records are digital, they hand me a clipboard full of paper. Now, I know these papers have no earthly value, and it frustrates me because they're the same forms I filled out before, but they've made it convenient. I can initial the forms. Yes, nothing's changed. Yes, nothing changed. Now, I just told her this, but it's still in the form, and on it goes. That frustrates me. But see, when we don't understand the purpose in suffering or in anything, we're naturally frustrated. Students, you probably ask this a lot. Why do I have to know trigonometry when I want to be a carpenter? Well, there's an answer to that. Or why do I need biology when I want to be a secretary? Why does any of this matter? Well, keep asking it. You'll get there eventually. I have no other words of wisdom for you. We get frustrated when we don't know the purpose. The sisters couldn't see any purpose in Lazarus' suffering and death. The boy couldn't see any purpose in racking up ACE scores. Let's go back to Romans 8:28. That's where we have to start. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. That irritating little word, good. And it becomes more irritating when we use it as a trite answer to somebody else's suffering. This is what we need to understand about good. The thousands of people that died in the Middle East over this past week was not good. The boy's trauma and suffering was not good. The suffering that you experience is not good. Cancer is not good. And you know what? God agrees with you. It's not good. So we have to look at this a little differently. I've taken the liberty of retranslating a bit. This is allowed in the text, so I'm just not making this up. We know that for those who love God, all things work together to benefit those who are called according to his purpose. What you are going through is not good. But Jesus Christ came to earth to redeem everything that you are going through and experience. And he will bring benefit to himself, to you, and to God's people. Don't look at suffering as good. Look at it as God will redeem it to make me more like Christ. He will redeem it to teach me something new about his character. And though I suffer, Jesus will redeem it to my benefit. How can we derive benefit from suffering? God's glorified. There we go with this narcissistic God again. This God who just has to be glorified in everything that happens. Well, first, he's glorified because he deserves it. He's God. But second of all, God being glorified is not divorced from our good. In fact, every time God is glorified, his people benefit. Some of you might be thinking through this sermon of some of the worst things that you've gone through. And I do want to say, before we continue, personally, it wasn't good. But when God is glorified out of it, that's part of his redeeming of that suffering. See, through that suffering, maybe he's teaching us a peace that we couldn't know without it. Peace is not the absence of suffering. Peace is a hope that we can learn within the suffering. We can learn to trust his character, his love, his mercy, his grace through the suffering. And here's another part of his character that we learn that I think we forget about sometimes. God will be glorified when his promise of justice for the suffering is kept. See, Jesus has promised his suffering people, I will administer justice. You may not see it in this life, But by the time I come back for you and your new life starts in the new heavens and the new earth, I will do justice for you. All the wrongs will be righted. And in that, God gets glory. God's people benefit. Jesus told the sisters plainly, or his disciples plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake, I'm glad that I wasn't there, so that you may believe. Suffering strengthens our faith. It puts us in such a deep relationship with Jesus Christ when we cling to him through our suffering, when we learn his character and learn to trust him, that the next time a bout of suffering comes along, it's not good either, but I guarantee you, you go through it a lot better than you did before. Ask to listen to the story of any of God's people, and they'll tell you, your boat isn't so rocked the second time around. And it doesn't get quite as rocked the third time around, because we know who has this. It doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it right, but God redeems it. There we go. He prepares us for a time to come without pain and without suffering. That's the ultimate end. That's the ultimate promise. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, Paul says. Yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. You remember that string? If anybody here last week, the string that Eric used? About this piece, so it was red string about this long, and the rest was white, and the white trailed all the way out through to the end. This little red piece was our life here on this earth. And what God is saying is that I will redeem your suffering that you experience in this life to prepare you for that eternal life, where you will experience much more than you could ever hope and dream. And it will be in a world without suffering, and it will be in a world of justice. But thirdly, our suffering can benefit other people. Many of the Jews believed in Jesus because of Lazarus' death and resurrection. His death was not good, but many believed. So many so that later on in chapter 12 we find out that the Jews wanted to kill Lazarus because so many were converting to Jesus Christ. See, his testimony spoke more gospel than his testimony spoken. It's like Andrew said the other week when he quoted St. Francis of Assisi. Always speak the gospel, and when you have to, use words. Christian history tells us that Lazarus went on to move to Cyprus. He became a leader in the church, and he ministered for Christ there for many years to come. Our suffering transforms us so that we can have greater impact on the kingdom. So let's look at the rest of the boy's story. What's the purpose of the boy's suffering? Well, God was glorified when he overcame and redeemed the odds of the ACE tests. God brings beauty from ashes. The boy's story tells the world about a Jesus who overcame our world of pain. And it cries out much more loudly than if the boy had been able to play the short game and avoid suffering. God redeemed the boy's pain. The suffering taught him love and patience and grace towards others. It taught him an unimaginable peace, so that when suffering comes again, his boat is rocked just a little less. The boy would not trade the depth of relationship he gained with his God, forged in suffering. He later entered seminary where he was ordained to gospel ministry. He even began serving children, and God finally called him to shepherd God's people, Grace Community Church. For you see, this story is my story. I'm a survivor of domestic violence, but that's not what defines me. Now, what I'm about to conclude is my story. It's where God has brought me. That's where I am on my path. It's not a prescription for you and your path. So don't compare again. Who am I? I am not damaged goods. God has redeemed each one of those aces for his glory, for my good and the good of others. I am a loved child of a sovereign God who wrote and ordained each chapter of my story before I was born, and he makes no mistakes. God is good, and he's good all the time. Other than the sin I committed, I would not change a single chapter of my story, because now I can say at age 52, my greatest concern in life is that I have so few years to serve him. So how do we conclude a sermon like this on suffering? I'm going to give you 3 practical suggestions on things you can do to redeem suffering. Instead of pursuing answers, pursue the character of Jesus Christ. Instead of answers, see, answers put us on a hamster wheel that actually are really going to never satisfy us, because God's never going to give us the answers that we think we want. He's going to give us the answers that we need. Without my story, I would not know the fruit of the Spirit the way I do. I would not know love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control to the depth that I know having gone through 7 aces. You know, it's a proud day when your son becomes your teacher. This is what A.T. Griner had to say. This is one characteristic of God that we come to know in our suffering. When we come to understand the sovereignty of God as he reveals it to us, the whys don't go away, but they do fade into the background. Truer statement I couldn't have made myself. Second, become a witness to God's character by telling your story. Now, you may not be there yet, and that's okay. But part of God redeeming your story is that eventually he'll call you to share your story with someone else. It may not be up here. It may be one-on-one, maybe with a coworker who you realize is going through the same thing you did. And you can bring encouragement and Christ to someone else through your story. God will be glorified. And third, take the time to enter into someone else's story without comparing yours to them. Sit with people. Listen. Encourage. Do not throw around pithy Bible verses. That's the most damaging thing we can do sometime. But we can sit, we can listen, we can tell our story, and so encourage them. I can conclude with a few verses from the book of Revelation. This is our hope. This is the ultimate redemption of our stories. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. That's God's people's story for the new heavens and the new earth. Let's pray. Heavenly Father,